Greetings fellow gorehounds and welcome back to another blood-splattered vlog. So much like last year, I'm going to do a series of 2017 catch-up vlogs because there was a ton of movies I didn't get to see last year that I really wanted to see, and it just doesn't feel right to compile a top 10 films of 2017 list having not seen all these movies that I wanted to see. And with that all said, let's dive into the first 2017 catch-up movie, Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water, and this movie is a really good example of why I do these catch-up vlogs in the first place. Because The Shape of Water is an utter masterpiece from start to finish, and it's absolutely going on my top 10 films list of last year. It's up there with Guillermo del Toro's best movies like The Devil's Backbone, Pan's Labyrinth, and Cronos, and even Crimson Peak, though I know I'm one of the few defenders of that particular movie, so I'll just set that one aside for now, but let it be known that I am a big fan of that movie as well. Anyway, The Shape of Water is utterly fantastic, and part of the reason I really love this movie is that it's a weird twist on The Little Mermaid, but done in reverse. Because in The Little Mermaid, you have this mermaid who gives up her voice to be with this prince on land, but in this movie, while the girl is still mute, she's actually the one on the land, and the so-called prince is actually the merperson. And the other thing I like about the movie is that on top of the Little Mermaid inversion, there's also a little bit of the creature from the Black Lagoon mixed in. In fact, I seem to recall at one point Guillermo del Toro talked about wanting to make a sequel to The Creature from the Black Lagoon, in which the girl from that movie and the creature fall in love and have a romance, and you could totally see how this movie is basically that movie. And I gotta say, in terms of romances, this is without a doubt the most romantic movie I saw all year. And yes, I say that knowing full well that this is a movie about a girl who falls in love with a fish man. And a fish man who is in no way a looker. This isn't like The Little Mermaid where it's a pretty princess under the sea. This girl essentially falls in love with Abe Sapien from Hellboy. With the connections to Abe Sapien also being strong in this movie because both Abe Sapien and the amphibian man in this movie are played by Doug Jones. And as usual, Doug Jones does a fantastic job in this movie. You completely forget that there's anyone underneath all the makeup. Though I will say the one complaint I could possibly have for this movie is that the makeup is a little too reminiscent of Abe Sapien. But even with that said, there's a lot of little details about this particular amphibian man that sets him apart from Abe Sapien, like in particular his skin glows at one point in this movie and it's beautiful. So ultimately, while it feels a little too reminiscent, it's really not much of a deal breaker. The performances are still fantastic, the makeup still looks damn good, and you are 100% rooting for this romance the entire time. Anyway, my fellow gorehounds, I've exhausted all I can say before we jump into the spoilers, so as per usual, I will include an Amazon affiliate link in the description below to something related to the movie, if not the movie itself. Now granted, since the movie's still in theaters, it's more than likely a pre-order link if there is a link in the description, but if not, I'll link some sort of related merch like a poster for the movie or something. And I should also remind you that as per usual, if you buy something using the link I put in the description, I will get a kickback from it. Oh yeah, and one more warning before we move on to the spoilers. This movie is a hard R. It's got nudity, it's got blood, and there is an on-screen death of a cat. So if animal death is too much for you, then you might want to avoid this movie. And with that all said, my fellow gorehounds, let us move on to the spoilers. Alrighty then, so this is something I don't normally do, but I really want to talk about the opening title sequence to this movie because it is a gorgeous work of art. Because basically this movie opens in an apartment that is completely flooded with water. So while you're seeing like the names of the costume designers and the makeup effects crew and the people who did the music for the movie, you're also seeing furniture and household appliances floating in the water, and it's like this kind of beautiful ballet. In fact, the thing it actually reminded me of the most is the Space Waltz from 2001: A Space Odyssey. And you're basically going through this underwater tour of the apartment like you're James Cameron doing an underwater tour of the Titanic or something. And what I really like about it is because it's evoking imagery from stuff like the Titanic, you know right away that this movie is going to be a tragedy. But on top of that, because it feels like this kind of beautiful underwater ballet, you also know there's something beautiful about this tragedy. Something, dare I say, romantic. And I also love the way this title sequence ends because it comes upon a shot of the main character floating in the water, seemingly dead or sleeping. But then slowly the water drains out of the apartment and she slowly floats back onto the couch, which comes back into its place, and then it reveals that she's actually asleep. The apartment never flooded, she was just dreaming. And just everything about the way this opening sequence is constructed is so beautiful, and it sets the tone so perfectly and just shows just what I love about this movie. This is not Guillermo del Toro doing his blockbuster action movie stuff like Hellboy or Blade 2 or Pacific Rim. This is del Toro pouring his heart and soul onto the screen into something that I can only describe as high art. but it's high art about a monster falling in love with the girl. So ultimately, it's still a genre picture, like just about every Del Toro movie is, now that I think about it. So anyway, after this scene, we get the basic setup of the movie. This girl, played by Sally Hawkins, is basically a janitor at this one government research facility, and the movie is set in this fantastical pseudo-1950s Cold War environment. And as a result of this, the sexism and the racism in her work environment is incredibly high. And that's actually another thing I really love about this movie. On top of the romance, on top of the whimsy and the fantastical nature of it, and on top of the tragedy of the movie, there's also a ton of social commentary within the subtext of this film. I mean, at its core, this movie is about a disabled woman, a black woman, and an old gay man rebelling against a rapey, rich, white government official. So yeah, the social commentary subtext is strong in this one. Anyway, at the beginning of the movie, on top of the mute main character, we're also introduced to her neighbor. And her neighbor is an artist who works in advertising, who also happens to be this elderly gay guy in the 1950s who has to kind of keep himself closeted. But because his gayness is really an open secret amongst those who know him, he has trouble getting work. But what he doesn't have trouble doing is getting along with our main character, and in fact is basically her best friend. Because every morning she wakes up and does her routine, which includes her masturbating in the bathtub, by the way, which I was not expecting but was greatly appreciated. Because, I mean, how many movies do you get to see where a girl openly masturbates on film? Outside of porno, you don't really see that because the MPAA tends to frown upon it. So I was pleasantly surprised to see that in this movie. Especially since this movie is about this girl and her sexuality, so why wouldn't you go into that? Anyway, every time she wakes up in the morning, she meets up with this neighbor and has breakfast with him. And every day after work, they grab dinner together and watch TV. And tell each other about their crazy day and the crushes they have and everything they're in. They're basically like girlfriends. But the other character we're introduced to is the main character's co-worker, played by Octavia Spencer. And she is not only her co-worker, but also like her second best friend. And we're shown this almost immediately when she arrives late to work, but Octavia Spencer is already waiting in line and clocks her in on time. So basically, every day Octavia Spencer puts her job on the line by doing this thing that is utterly illegal, but she does it for her friend to help her out. But then about 20 minutes into this movie, after being introduced to these main characters, we are also introduced to our villain of the story. And the villain is played by Michael Shannon in one of the best performances of his entire career. And watching Michael Shannon play this character who is equal parts intimidating and just smart enough to figure out things that are going on before they happen, but he's also not smart in a way that makes him extremely dangerous. And I'm not exactly sure how to explain what I mean by that. The best way I can think of to describe it is to use an example from the movie. Because his character is introduced as essentially the guy who captured the amphibian creature that brings it to the lab, and he works for the military and the government and yada yada yada. But he is constantly in conflict with the scientists that work at that lab that are trying to research this creature, because he sees it as either a potential danger or a potential weapon. A danger because if he is a potential weapon and the Soviets get a hold of him, then America's fucked. But a potential weapon because he has all these abilities that humans don't normally have, which would be amazing if we were to implement it on humans. So he's smart enough to figure all that out, but he's not smart enough to realize that torturing the creature is probably not the best way to get this information. And that's the way he handles just about every situation, which makes him a very effective villain. Because you are constantly afraid for the well-being of all the main characters in this movie because you keep seeing the way he's acting. So anyway, they bring in the fish creature, the scientists are trying to study it, but Michael Shannon is just torturing the shit out of it. But eventually our main character discovers it and starts to become friends with it. And the way she becomes friends with it is she offers it the kindness that Michael Shannon is not offering him. And one of the ways she does that is by giving him food. In particular, she gives him hard-boiled eggs. And so basically the main character starts this routine. She goes throughout her day normally, but then around lunchtime she'll sneak off with the creature. She is the first one to figure out that the creature can communicate with humans because she teaches it sign language. But as the movie goes on, she starts to fall more and more in love with the creature. But unfortunately, we have a bit of a ticking time bomb going on in the movie. Because Michael Shannon's superiors want answers and they want answers fast, and Michael Shannon thinks the only way to get answers is to dissect the creature. And the head scientist completely disagrees with that because if you dissect it, then it's dead. There's nothing more to observe. Now granted, it turns out the scientist has another ulterior motive because, as it turns out, he is actually a Russian agent. But when he reports back to his Russian comrades and explains to him that they have a ticking time bomb going on, his Russian comrades give him a needle to inject the creature with so that it may die. Because it turns out the Russians are just as afraid of the Americans learning something from this creature as the Americans are of the Russians finding out. But the head science guy / Russian spy does not want to kill the creature. He sees it as inhumane. And he sees so much scientific potential in the creature that to just kill it is a waste. So what ends up happening is the main character ends up convincing her gay neighbor to break the creature out of the facility before they dissect it. And the head scientist / Russian spy has a similar plan that is completely separate from theirs. And while this is all going on, Octavia Spencer is figuring out that her friend is starting to fall in love with the fish. And all these intricate storylines end up all colliding during the day of the dissection. And all these characters end up teaming up with one another against Michael Shannon in order to save the creature. And everything so far I have described is essentially the first half of the movie. Because after that, there's a second half of this movie in which the fish is now living in the main character's apartment. And during this time, they figure out that not only can the fish man heal wounds, it can also have sex because, well, the main character totally has sex with it. That's right, I shit you not. This is a movie in which a girl falls in love with the fish man and actually fucks it. Now granted, it's done very tastefully, but it does happen in the movie. And it leads to this really hilarious sequence the next day in which she's describing the fishman's penis to Octavia Spencer. Anyway, after that initial ticking time bomb is completed and they successfully save the fishman, there's now a new one in play. Because now the main character has to nurse the fishman back to health before Michael Shannon discovers that she has him. And on top of that, there's a subplot of the main scientist / Russian spy guy going back to his comrades trying to get an extraction from America. And he's trying to do this before Michael Shannon also figures out about him. But on top of that, it's very obvious that his comrades are probably going to kill him before Michael Shannon can. And while this is all going on, her gay best friend and Octavia Spencer are trying their best to keep her secret. And you can tell that they're good friends because the gay best friend does this despite the fact that the fishman eats his cat. And good God, I don't want to keep giving like a play-by-play of the movie, but there's so many great parts in the second half of the movie. Like on top of the romantic sex scene, there's also a scene in which she floods her bathroom so that they can dance in the water. And there's another sequence in which she imagines romantically singing to him like a musical. So there's actually like a 1950s style musical number in this movie with the main character who is mute singing. And it's super romantic and super beautiful and brought a tear to my eye. Just good God, this movie is utterly fantastic, and I'm not going to spoil a single additional thing about this film. If you want to know what happens at the end of this movie, if you want to know if Michael Shannon catches them, if they end up getting away, if their romance can live on, if the fishman lives but escapes, then you're going to have to watch this movie on your own and find out for yourself. And with that all said, my fellow Gorehounds, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and don't forget to ring that notification bell so that you're notified of my videos immediately upon their upload. And as always, peace out, my fellow Gorehounds, and I'll catch y'all later.